Please stand for the gospel reading. So for the gospel this morning, I've chosen a passage that will feed into the homily that I want to give this morning. And in all of the gospels, it's the only account of an event in the childhood of Jesus, apart from his birth. And he's a preteen, probably just bar mitzvahed, and he's on his first journey to Jerusalem with his family. Once a year, all Jewish adults had to go to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. And they would come from all over the world, from the diaspora, not just from the land of Israel. So the population of Jerusalem would swell from about 40,000 people to about 1.5 million. There'd be a huge tent city all around as people flocked in. And you can just imagine the array of emotions that went on. So here's a family packing to go on this journey, maybe 5 or 6 day journey, and they go in caravans, the whole village moving off together with their donkeys and supplies, and the camaraderie there was and the excitement. And there's the child Jesus, his first trip to Jerusalem, really, really excited. And then there's the festival itself and the sights and the sounds and the crowds and whatever. And then everybody's tired and they want to go back home, and they make the first day's journey. They're probably maybe traveling 15 to 20 miles a day with their donkeys and their packs. And so they get to the first evening on the way back, and they discover that the child is missing. Now, any of you parents who've ever lost a child, you know what that feels like. They're anxious first, and then they're terrified, terror-struck. And so they head back for Jerusalem, and they spend 3 days trying to find him. So you can imagine what that was like. And then they finally come across him in the temple. And his mother says, as many mothers have said since, "Jesus, where were you?" And like every pre-teenager, he's part defiant and part obedient. So he says, "Didn't you realize I had to be, doing my shtick?" But then he went back to Jerusalem and he was subject to them. So he got all this range of emotions. And I'm going to talk about journeys today and when we get lost. So here's the reading itself in the original from Luke's Gospel. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to this custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled for a full day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and at his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom, in stature, and in favor with God and with people. Words inspired by God. I want to dedicate the homily today to a man called Thomas Collins, whom I met for the first time 2 weeks ago in Ireland. I had never clapped eyes on him in my life before that, and in all likelihood, I'll never see him again. And he certainly will never see or hear this homily, and still I want to dedicate it to him. And here's the backstory. I spent 2 weeks in Ireland on vacation from the 5th of June to the 19th of June. And I went home specifically because it was my brother Seamus's 70th birthday on the 17th. So I wanted to be there to celebrate him. And when I go home now, since my parents died, I always stay with himself and his wife Jackie. And they live outside a little town called Clonakilty in West Cork, about 5 miles outside the town. But while I was there, I made contact with a very old friend of mine, Father Eamon Hayden, who was my spiritual director in the seminary for 8 years. He was a very close friend of mine over the years. He then went on and he worked in Zambia and went home to Ireland to retire last year after developing stomach cancer. So I knew him very, very well, and his sister, May Burns, and her daughter, Maureen, I've known them for years and years and years and years and years. but I hadn't seen them for a long time. So I decided to try and pay a visit to my old seminary, and on the way to visit May and Maureen Burns. Now, they live in a tiny little hamlet called Tinryland in County Carlow, which is on the east coast, more or less, of Ireland. And so I got a loan of my mother's car, which is now owned by one of my nieces, Deirdre Og, a 1997 Ford Fiesta. And Peg had gone to visit these people umpteen times, so I figured the car would know the way. It's been up and down many, many, many times. But to be sure, I also had on my phone an application called Waze. Do you know that? Yeah? So it gives you feedback where there's traffic and stuff. So I figured, now with Peg's car and Waze, there's no way I can get lost. And the agreement was that I would arrive there for lunchtime at 1 o'clock on Sunday, June 10th. So I consulted Waze, and it told me it's going to take you 2 hours and 40 minutes. So to be sure, I left at 9 a.m. to get there at 1 o'clock. And I arrived at 1:30. I spent 4.5 hours on a 2 hours, 40-minute journey. Because here's what happened. I head off from Clonakilty and going great guns. I'm 75% of the way there. I get to a big city called Kilkenny, and all of a sudden, my iPhone dies. Battery has gone dead. Now I have no directions, and what's even worse, I can't phone Seamus, and I can't phone the Burns. I can't, find out where I'm going, and I can't get direction from behind me. And I don't know if you've noticed, there's no pay phones anywhere anymore. And even if there were, I couldn't remember Seamus's number, and I certainly couldn't remember the Burns number. So I'm stuck in Kilkenny, this big, big city, and I'm freaking out. So I go into a gas station, and I buy a bar of chocolate to kind of soothe my frayed nerves, and I chomp on it, and I ask for directions, and they give me directions. And that story repeats itself 5 more times over the next hour and a half. I get the directions and a bar of chocolate, I eat the chocolate, head off, and within 5 or 6 minutes, I'm lost again. And I go into the next gas station I can find, buy another bar of chocolate, chomp on it, get directions, head off, and get lost again. So this happened about 5 or 6 times. At this stage, I'm bloated with chocolate, and I'm still lost. So at one stage, I find myself way out in the countryside. There's only cows around. And I see a farmhouse to the side of the road. So I drive up, and I knock at the front door, and this guy comes out with a mouthful of food. I'm munching away, and he said, "I'm really sorry to disturb your lunch. I'm looking for Tinryland. Can you tell me how to get to Tinryland?" So he said, "Go down the road there and now take the first left." I said, "First left?" "Yeah, first left, take the first left." And I say, is there a signpost there?" "Oh, no, Jez, there's no signpost there, just take the first left." "Okay, great, thanks a million." He goes back to his meal. So I go back to my car and I drive very carefully, and after half a mile, there's a road goes to the left. So I swing the car off the road, and I notice I'm on a track, it's not as wide as this, and there's grass down the middle. And I go across a little river, about half a mile down, and up the other bank, and after 2 miles, I find myself in a farmer's backyard. And there's an old man, even though it's a Sunday morning, welding a part onto his tractor. And the man's name is Thomas Collins. So I explain my predicament to him, and he's very, very good. He starts giving me directions. And then he looks at me, realizes this guy really isn't very bright. And to make matters worse, he has a Cork accent. So he can't be that bright. So he takes a box off the shelf, we're out in his garage, and he tears a piece off it. And he starts drawing a map. Here it is, I kid you not. The back of it is, it's food for kittens. So he draws in a river, the one that I just crossed over, and then a road, and then he draws in a housing estate. I'm going to pass this around, 3 or 4 houses, and a bunch of roads that I shouldn't take, and a motorway that I should go over. And then he reaches the end of the cardboard, he realizes there's not enough room, so he tears off another piece. And we continue, here we go. And finally, he draws in a church. You'll pass the church, I'll show it to you. There's a church drawn in there. And then a whole bunch of other roads that I'm to ignore. And then finally, Tinryland. So I was so impressed, I said, I need you to autograph this for me. So we autographed it down here. Thomas Collins, and that's how I know his name. I'm going to pass it around to you. So I was deeply grateful to him. And I came back out, crossed the river, got onto the main road, and got lost. So another hour and a half I'm going around, and finally I see this big, big house with big, big gates, like an estate. But I can't get in. But there's a bell outside. I ring the bell, and this guy comes out. Obviously, he's not Irish. He looked kind of Middle Eastern and very, very poor, broken English. So I'm wondering, is there much point in asking him? So I said, do you know where Tinryland is or where the Burns live? No. But if you go down the road the other side, the principal of the primary school lives in the house just down on the other side of this road. So I drive down there and I go in, and a woman comes to the door. I say, are you the principal of the primary school? She says, no, my husband is, Mr. Shannon. So I said, what's your name? Trudy. I'm Trudy Shannon. I said, hi, I'm Seán ÓLaoire. I'm looking for May Burns' house in Tinryland. And of course, she knew everybody. So she gave me precise directions. I was actually only about a half mile away from it, going round and round the circles. So I finally got there at 1:30 p.m., 4.5 hours after, a 2-hour, 40-minute safari. So the girl, Maureen, plugs in my phone. She's an iPhone as well, and she charges the battery for me. And we have this great, great big feast. And then that evening, Father Eamon and myself, we go on to the seminary where I trained for 8 years, and I spend the next day there. And then it's time to come home. Now at least I got a full charged phone in business. So I plug in, Clonakilty, County Cork, and it says to me, we do not recognise what road you're on. I think, okay. I'm in the middle of the countryside in the seminary. They're just roads inside in a big place. I'll drive onto kind of a road and they'll recognise the road. So I drive out of it. It's about half a mile to get to a road. And I try again. It says, we do not recognise the road you're on. I think, well, I may get onto a major road and they'll certainly recognise the major road. So I drive about 3 miles onto a fairly big road. I try again and it says, you have no internet connection. So at this stage, I'm tearing my hair out. So I drive to the nearest town, get my requisite bar of chocolate, ask for directions, and they give me directions, and I see a signpost for Kilkenny. Kilkenny is a big, big city. So at least I figure, if I get to Kilkenny, there's some chance I'll find a road to Cork. So I drive to Kilkenny, right in the middle, it's a big city, and I stop and I ask directions. And this guy says to me, you need to go back to the first roundabout and go through the first roundabout, and when you get to the second roundabout, turn the left, and that'll take you onto the motorway that's going south. So I follow his directions, and I got onto some big road, and I drive for about a half an hour. I feel really, really good, and I find myself back in Kilkenny. Half an hour later. So at this stage, I had another bar of chocolate at this stage. So I say, the first main road I find, I'm just going to take it, and I'm going to go left, because I think I'm heading westwards, and if I go left, I'll be going south, and Cork is to the south. So I find a motorway, and I keep going, and I get a grand tour of the southeast coast of Ireland. I go down through Waterford, Dungarvan, Middleton, Youghal, and I finally arrive home 5 hours later, many bars of chocolate. And they're so relieved to see me. We have a big feast. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to use that as a metaphor for our journey. And I'm going to just make 3 main points this morning. The first one, I'm going to talk about symbols on the journey. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about the tag team on the journey. And then thirdly, about emotions on the journey. So firstly, the symbols of the journey. In all great spiritual traditions, all great wisdom traditions, journey is probably the most significant metaphor or archetype of incarnation. You find it in many, many different forms. You find it for individuals, you find it for little groups, and you find it for entire nations. So for instance, you have Joseph Campbell's famous work, The Hero's Journey, the hero with 1,000 faces, because everyone is a hero or a heroine on this journey. So in some senses, journey represents the safari of the individual during incarnation. And you find it in all traditions. You find it for particular groups, not just for individuals. Every individual must make that journey, and you must get lost, and you must experience all the emotions, in the course of the journey. But we do it as groups as well. And so you have Homer's famous Odyssey, where a whole group of soldiers are on a journey after the famous Battle of Troy and spend years and years and years on the road getting lost. And you have entire nations who do it. You have the story in the Bible of the Exodus, where 605,500, Israelite troops, not to mention old people and young people and mothers and whatever, head off out of the land of Egypt and spend 40 years getting lost in the desert before they finally arrive in the promised land. So we do this, as groups, and we do it as individuals. The journey of life is fraught with difficulties. So that's the first great archetype that I learned, as I was eating my chocolate. The second great one is that, meals in some senses represent the banquet of heaven, that represent Eucharist, or the fact that when we finally get home, people celebrate our arrival and the fact that in spite of how many times we may have gotten lost, we finally made it home. So I got this great big feast in Carlow and Tinryland. When I get back to Clonakilty, I get this great feast. So we know, for instance, there's a special branch of anthropology called cultural anthropology, and a special subsection called commensality, where an anthropologist goes into a brand new tribe, and simply by looking at what food they will eat and what they won't eat, when they eat, with whom they will eat, and with whom they will refuse to eat, they can tell you the entire social stratification of the tribe, just by watching them at mealtimes. And so meals are so important. And so the difference between bars of chocolate and banquets is very good. Bars of chocolate represent, addictions to kind of help us when we're frustrated or terrified or whatever. The meals are where we relax with the people who are part of our cohort group. So the two meals, that bookended my journey, made me realize that, this is what it's about. The journey to heaven, nirvana, self-realization, enlightenment, whatever word you want to call it. It's really about sharing meals with those whom we love. The next metaphor I wanted to mention then was the difference between the car and the driver. I was hoping that Peg's car would get me there because it had been there many, many times. And in some senses, the car represents the spacesuit and the driver represents the soul in the spacesuit, spirits in spacesuits. And in some senses, I am a reincarnation of Peg. So it was her car. It was appropriate that I'm using her spacesuit to try to get to this place because I'm descended from her, I came from her womb. So in some senses, there was safety in driving Peg's car. But I had to be the driver of it. Now, the problem is there's always a backseat driver. No matter how good the soul is that comes in to try to drive the car, there's some dude in the backseat telling you you're doing it wrong. You're going the wrong way, or you need to go someplace else. So a self-appointed navigator, which we call the ego. So in every car, there's going to be an ego. There's going to be a backseat driver, a self-appointed navigator who's going to make us get lost again and again and again. And certainly, I encountered that guy many, many times on June 10th. So that's the third great image. The next one then will be the fact that, Thomas Collins' map. There are maps for the journey, written, diagrams. And we call these the great scriptural traditions of the world. The Bible, or the Bhagavad Gita, or the Analecta of Confucius, or the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, or the Pitakas of the Buddha. So many, many different written accounts and diagrams of how to go on the journey. And that can be really, really helpful. The only problem is, the map is not the terrain. And no matter how good Thomas Collins's drawings are, it's hard to recognize a church from his squiggle, and hard to recognize a housing estate from 3 little boxes he drew. So I got lost anyway. So in spite of all the scriptural traditions, we managed to get lost. And part of the problem is that Thomas is not the ultimate cartographer. It was a real interesting effort and it really helped me for the first half mile of the journey. But after that, I got lost anyway. The problem with the scriptural traditions is that, as well as the kind of the divine wisdom that comes through, there's all the cultural accretion and projection that gets loaded onto stuff, like Paul's letter this morning to the Romans. All kind of, at this stage, age-inappropriate thinking. And that gets lambasted and loaded onto the scriptural traditions. So we can't always just depend literally on the scriptures for guidance. And then there are the kind of the people who gave us directions, the people, Mrs. Trudy Shannon, or the guy at his front gate, those who talk to us and give us directions, oral directions. These would be like the great oral traditions, the great stories, the great mythology that were never written down, but that have really inspired us. Every culture has its own mythology. The stories and the proverbs which encapsulate the archived wisdom of the culture. These are really, really helpful as well. But like any myth, you can unpack it in a variety of ways. And so you can take the same myth and somebody will unpack it in a fundamentalist fashion and, become a terrorist. Somebody else will unpack it and become a mystic. So the stories allow us, we can only unpack the stories depending on the level at which we've arrived. So all these aids, these are all of the symbols that we engage. So these are all the stuff that's going through my mind in 4.5 hours. I'm going to get back finally to Clonakilty. And I began thinking, I knew I was going to take this map with me 6,000 miles, cross the Atlantic, and show it to somebody at this side. Because it was the occasion for me to begin really thinking about my own journey and our journey. And the fact that sometimes getting lost is important. I wouldn't have met Thomas Collins if I hadn't gotten lost. You wouldn't have heard his name today if I hadn't gotten lost several times. I wouldn't have had 10 bars of chocolate if I hadn't gotten lost a whole bunch of times. So there's always a reason and a purpose in getting lost as long as we finally arrive. So that's kind of the first point, I would say, the kind of the symbols of the journey. The second point I want to make then would be, I call it the tag team on the journey, because none of us comes in to this safari on our own. Nobody incarnates as an individual person. We're always part of a cohort group that I've called, people with whom we make a preconception contract. And there are various levels of this contract, from your soulmate to your family of origin, to your friends, to your community, to your tribe, to your nation, to your species, to all sentient beings. There are various levels of this contract. And we come in some senses, the significant people roped to each other. We're like climbers on Mount Everest. Nobody, unless they're really, really brilliant at it, only very few people have accomplished it, are going to attempt to get to the top of Mount Everest alone. Mostly they're roped together in teams. So if one guy falls over a crevice, the other 5 of us can hold on to him. So we come into incarnation roped together. And it's interesting that part of this group that's roped to us, sometimes they're family, sometimes they're friend, sometimes they're foe. We have no idea who's roped to us. And the foe can be as important as the friend or the family, because we will learn from them as much as we learn from others. Everybody with whom we're roped, is important in our life. So we have to realize that as we come in, we're coming in as a team. The Catholic Church has this beautiful notion of the communion of saints, that people who are on the planet, who are alive, people who have died, they're still in communication with each other, and they're helping each other out. So we have many, many helpers at the other side of the veil, who are constantly assisting us in this journey. And so we're part of a tag team. There's a whole group of helpers. Some of them are teachers we're going to meet, family members, friends that we're going to meet, but people across the veil as well who are helping us to get there. The next important member of the tag team is Source, or God, or whatever word you want to give to it. And in some senses, God is like this extraordinary GPS system. Maybe one of the greatest gifts I ever got was somebody gave me a gift of a GPS system many, many years ago, given my paw for getting lost. And what I found out about the GPS system is that it always knows where you are, apart from the one in Kiltegan, which told me it didn't recognize the road. So obviously that wasn't God speaking. God would have recognized the road, even if it was only a track. So somebody hijacked my GPS in Kiltegan. But mainly, your GPS system always knows where you are. And so when you plug in your destination, it knows where you're starting from, so it can give you appropriate kinds of suggestions. And the next thing is, no matter how many times you mistake the suggestions or you ignore the suggestions, God is not going to get angry with you and say, I told you hang a left. You never find that. He says, okay. I presume you still need to go to the place you indicated was your destination, so here's what you need to do now. So it will constantly modify the suggestions in order to get you to your destination from where you currently are. It never berates you. And one of the most extraordinary things I've realized is that you can plug in any destination you want, good, bad, or indifferent, and God will never say, I don't want to take you there. You put in a destination, you ask for suggestions, God will say, okay, that's how you get there. I want to be this avaricious dictator. How do I go about it? You're going to find out. There's ways in doing it. And God is not going to say, I don't want you to become an avaricious dictator. God, in some senses, had no agenda. You're going to grow at your own pace. So if that's what you want to become as part of your journey, okay, we'll show you how to do that. So Hinduism has this great teaching that incarnations proceed in 4 different phases. And there can be hundreds of incarnations per phase. The first one is dedicated to sensuality. Great food, great drink, and great sex. And Hinduism says there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you do it, with a sense of morality and respect for other people. There's nothing wrong with that. We'll teach you the Kama Sutra, and we'll teach you 1,000 different recipes. Nothing with that. But at some stage, you're going to realize there must be more to life than just sensuality, and you realize there is power, privilege, and prestige. I know you want to become a powerful person, controlling a whole bunch of other people, and the system is okay. You need to experience that, go for it. Now again, there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's exercised well, but of course it's very difficult to do that. And this is an epigenetic model, so each subsequent stage incorporates but goes beyond the previous ones. Doesn't mean that when you're seeking power, you suddenly lose your appetite for good wine. But there's a third phase, and it's called, service, where you realize that there must be more to life than sensuality and power, privilege, and prestige, and that is being of compassionate service to other people. And that's the third great stage. And so many, many incarnations, you become a compassionate, a Mother Teresa figure. But Hinduism says that's not the end of the journey. There's a fourth level, and it's called Moksha. And Moksha is ultimate liberation, because you realize that even service is predicated on some notion of duality, that we're separated from each other, that I'm of service to you. Ultimately, Moksha is the realization there is only one of us. And so literally it's just the right hand washing the left hand. I'm not helping you, you are not helping me. It's like self helping self. And so we step away through these different parts of it. And so in some senses, that's God's contribution. God will never say, you can't do that, I'm not allowing you to do that. He'll say, I give you alerts. If you've got a GPS system and you're in a 30 mile an hour zone doing 45, you'll see on your screen something is going to be flashing saying, this is 30 mile an hour zone, you're doing 45. Do you want to do something about that? But God is not going to jam on the brakes and stop you from going, 45. Never going to do that. Or you start going down a one-way street the wrong direction, there'll be a flashing indicator on your GPS system. God is not going to say, no, I'm not going to take you down there, you're going the wrong way. Okay, that's what you want to do. You need to learn from that, go for it, go down the wrong way. So again and again and again, God allows us to do the journeys that we asked to do, because it's all part of our growing. And sometimes making mistakes is a hugely important part of actually finding the right way eventually. And then the third member of the tag team is yourself. So at your end of the GPS system, there has to be some kind of a listening device. In my case, it was my iPhone. The problem was the iPhone was dead. There was no charge in it. So it's not good enough to have a listening device to God if it's not charged. So how do you charge it? You charge it by some kinds of spiritual practices. You've got to keep the battery up enough to listen and to be able to hear the voice of God. And so you have to do what you need to do in order to have your listening voice, a device tuned to what God needs to do. And you have to realize that ultimately, in some sense of it, even though we're part of a tag team, ultimately you're on your own in the sense that you have total free will. You can do or not do what you choose to do or to not do. And so that's your responsibility. So that would be my second point. And this is the tag team with whom we make this journey. And then thirdly then, the emotions that we experience on the journey or the safari of incarnation. So just like, as I said at the beginning, I'm just trying to imagine the roller coaster emotions that Joseph and Mary went through, on this journey to Jerusalem and back. It starts off with great excitement and camaraderie and the devotional mysticism of the Passover ceremonies. And then the journey back home is good to get home. And then the fear and the anxiety when the child is missing. And then the journey back to the city at night. And 3 days they can't find him. How are you going to find a 12-year-old kid in Jerusalem? There have been 1.5 million people that gathered for the feast. You can say, have you seen my son? Well, what does he look like? Oh, well, he has a Galilean accent. Okay, there's 40,000 more Galileans in the city. He's a very precocious kid. If you talk to him, you realize he's real bright. So you're going to go around the city, for 3 days, asking those kinds of questions. And finally, somehow, they wind up in the temple, and there he is doing his shtick. 12-year-old kid, debating the teachers and the scholars. And like any mother or father who's lost a child, the first one is, oh God, the relief, and then the anger. Jesus, how could you do that to us? And then there's the child trying to self-defend, and at the same time, being obedient. So this roller coaster. And I had a mini version of that, on Sunday, the 10th of June, up around Carlow. Going through all these different emotions. I can't believe it. There are guys whizzing past me on the motorway at 75 miles an hour. And I look at each one and I'm thinking, that guy knows where he's going and he knows how to get there. What is wrong with me? How come I never can figure out how to get to where I want to be? And they're just whoosh, 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 right, 75 miles an hour. And I realized, well, I wouldn't have met Thomas Collins and I wouldn't have had 10 bars of chocolate, and I wouldn't have had the great relief of finally making it home. So this roller coaster of emotions. And I get it finally that maybe the two most important ingredients are a sense of humor, to be able to laugh at my own stupidity, and patience, to be able to, work with my own stupidity. Because the funny thing is, I've gotten lost probably 10,000 times in my life, and eventually I always get home. I'm here right now. I'm still, no matter how many times I get lost, I'm still here. And no matter how many times you got lost, you're here. And that's the great mystery of it. No matter how many detours we take or how many distractions we have, every single one of us is ultimately going to get home. Home being nirvana, self-realization, God, source, whatever you want to give to it. So maybe that's the most important consideration of all. Every single human being will eventually make it home. And the second thing I want to just leave us with before we open up the discussion is, no matter how alone you may feel, how lonely, how frightened, how anxious, how even terrified you are, on this incarnational safari, there are always, always companions on your journey. So let's open up a little bit.
Do you remember how we came to be called companions on the journey?
Yes, I do. Our great buddy Lou Matone, when we founded the community, and it was just done on the spur of the moment, after a vote was taken in Thomas Merton Centre, whether or not to go back to the parish, or whether to keep going on our own. And we lost the vote by nine votes, like 109 to 100 or whatever it was. And right there and then, there's a bunch of us, including yourself, who decided, okay, Maureen was there, we're going to keep going. And we had to try to register ourselves somewhere, and we figured out what are we going to call ourselves now. We used to be known as the Thomas Merton Centre, and Lou Matone came up with it, let's call ourselves Companions on the Journey, because it was a hymn that we used to sing. Yeah, so Lou is the father of the name, and I've reminded him of that many times. Yeah. Joanna.
This is a kind of a funny thing.
Okay, good. We could use a bit of humor.
So James and I have been to Ireland 3 times.
Okay.
And we've gotten many, many directions from the people of Ireland. And I'd say about 97% of the time, they're very unclear once you start going. And the proof of that is we were in Clonakilty, and Deirdre was trying to tell us how to get out of Clonakilty. And James and I looked at each other, we kind of wrote it down, and we just kind of went, And then we talked to her husband, who's British, and he drew us a map, and it was very specific. And so there's something within the Irish, the island itself and the culture and how people communicate that you have to find your way, you meander, and then you find out where you're supposed to be going in the first place for a while.
That's brilliant. It's great. You're absolutely right. So the Irish psyche is such that they're much more, concerned about the fact that you might get lost than that you might find your way. So they're going to tell you all the ways in which you can get lost. Yeah. So any Irish direction is going to say to you, you go down the road there now 120 metres, and there'll be a road off to your right. It's going down to Bennykerry, and there's a church down at Berrykenny, and there's a river down there. Do not take that road. So you keep going and go for another 1.5 miles, and there's a road going up to you. It's going up to the hill, and you'll see a lad's bicycle at the side of the road. That's the postman. That's Michael the postman. He'll be delivering letters down there. Do not take that road. So they're going to give you 15 different roads you shouldn't take. And then finally they'll tell you the one to take. But in the meantime, there's 15 no-no-nos that have registered before the first yes. So we're so concerned that you don't get lost. We're not concerned that you're going to get the way. And they'll constantly say, you can't go wrong. They'll tell you that again and again. There's no way you can miss it. You can't go wrong. That's part of the protocol when you give directions in Ireland. You have to say every 5 or 6 sentences, you can't go wrong. There's no way you can miss it.
This is a basic question.
Sure.
Have you considered not mixing chocolate and navigation?
Have I considered not mixing chocolate and navigation? Yeah. Ask any addict, have you considered giving up your addiction when you're anxious? I can't not eat chocolate when I'm lost. Besides, I needed to go into some place to ask directions, and it's very rude to go in and just ask directions without contributing something. So I need to contribute a few euros and get a bar of chocolate in exchange. And then you can't waste a bar of chocolate, you have to eat it.
So I'm most interested.
Oh, Lawrence.
I am most interested in what your spiritual director and other people you found at the seminary had to say about the strange journey of Seán ÓLaoire, way off the straight and narrow.
Interesting. So fascinating. So it was my first time back in the seminary in about 15 years. I trained there for 8 years, as a young man between 18 and 26. Then spent 14 years in Africa, got thrown out by the government, spent a year in London studying, psychology, and then came to the States to study here. And in the meantime, my society, the Kiltegan Fathers or the St. Patrick's Missionary Society, did not want me coming to the States. They wanted me to go to Rome to study scripture, and my faith wasn't strong enough to survive Rome, so I decided I wouldn't. So, I was really disobedient. So on the 23rd of June, which is just yesterday, was my 31st anniversary in the States. On the 23rd of June, 1987, I went back to London, where I had been living for a year. I went up to the Pan Am desk in Heathrow, and I said, "Is there a plane going to San Francisco today?" And they said, "There is." I said, "Are there seats on it?" And they said, "There are." "Could I buy one?" "You could." So I forked over money. I borrowed money from my family. I'd already been accepted into the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology to study. I had a visa for it. So I got on board a plane, on the 23rd of June, 1987, and I landed in San Francisco. I have no idea where I'm going to stay. I've been told that I need to go down to De Anza College and do 2 more courses in psychology, developmental psychology and something else, in order to qualify for the PhD program. And so I come out of the airport on the 23rd of June 1987, and I'm looking around for buses. And I ask, "Is there a bus going down to Cupertino?" And I'm told, "There's a bus. This is a bus goes right through Cupertino." So I have a suitcase, big suitcase that I've been backwards and forward to Africa many, many times, with a rope tied around it. It was bulging at the seams with books, an old battered thing. And I'm dragging this behind me. And I get on the bus and I say, "Can you tell me when we get to Cupertino so I can get off?" And the driver says, "Fine." And so we're speeding through it, and I remember very well seeing a sign for Menlo Park and thinking, because there's a Menlo Park in County Galway, after which this place was actually called. Wow, I'm not far from home after all. And we keep going and going and going and going, and finally the driver conductor stops. "I'm really sorry." He says, "We're in Saratoga. I forgot to tell you where Cupertino is." So I get off the bus, and I'm lugging this back to Cupertino and dragging it along the street. I had no idea where I'm going to stay. So I spent the first night in a little a motel. So I start my studies. I make contact with the church in Saratoga. I worked there for 2 months while I'm finishing stuff in Cupertino. And then Palo Alto had just amalgamated 5 parishes at that stage. And so they're looking for priests. So I lived for the next 5 years in St. Albert's, where I met was Manny and Margie, in August of 1987. I worked there for 5 or 6 years. Then they got moved around quite a bit between the 5 churches. And in the meantime, every 4 or 5 years, I get a message from Kiltegan saying, "We've appointed you to Zambia, or we've appointed you to Brazil." And each time I say, "I'm not going, I'm not ready." And finally, when they were tearing their hair out, they said, "We're starting a counselling centre in London. We want you to take charge of it." I'd finished my degree at this stage. At this stage, I wrote back and I said, "I'm probably never going back to work with Kiltegan." So I said, "I realise it's not fair. You're legally responsible for me. If I were to commit a crime, you'd be legally responsible, but you have no control over me, so it's not fair." So I propose that we have some kind of an amicable separation. So when I go home to Ireland next year, let's talk about it. So I go back there next year, have a great meeting with the Superior General over 2 or 3 days. They're really kind. And I say, honestly, I've, for the first 18 years of my life, I've done what my parents told me to do. For the next 8 years of my life, I did what the seminary authorities told me to do. For the next 14 years of my life, I did what the bishop told me to do. Now I'm going to make my own decisions. I'm not going to ever again let anybody tell me what I need to do with my life. I'll follow my own kind of course. So let's see if there's somewhere we can amicably split so I can leave this Society of St. Patrick's Missionary Society. And he was very open to me. He said, "Okay, let's just look at the canon law of that and we'll get back to you." So I come back, and 3 months later I get a letter saying, "Seán, I'm disappointed to tell you that we have no problem, separating amicably, but the Vatican does. You can't just leave a society like St. Patrick's Missionary Society. You got to get fired, to be thrown out." I said, "Okay. And what will the charges be?" And said, the 2 charges, 2 canon laws which I had broken. The first one is loss of faith. You no longer believe what the Catholic Church says is the reality. And the second one is disobedience. And I said, "You know what? I can't quibble with either of those." They're absolutely right. So I heard nothing for about a year and a half. And then one day I get a 2-page letter in Latin from the Vatican telling me they no longer required my services. Yeah. So I hadn't been back in Kiltegan since then. So now I go back and I get a really wonderful reception, except to see that things have changed radically. So in the course of my being there, I got to meet a whole bunch of old friends. And one guy called Ned Ryan, who had just come back from Zambia after like 46 years there. And he said to me, I was giving a homily in a church 2 or 3 weeks ago, and people asked me about, my experience as a priest. And I said, when I joined Kiltegan in 1961, which he did, he said, the cemetery was empty and the seminary was full. Now I go back there, 50 years later, and the cemetery is full and the seminary is empty. And it really kind of encapsulated. I actually went into the cemetery. When I was there was maybe 5 or 6 headstones, and I took a photograph of every single headstone in the cemetery because I wanted to kind of just revisit the stories and the characters. There's about 150 of them. I took individual photographs that I want to go through and just kind of refamiliarize myself with the great characters I knew. The great friends I had there, people whom I really admired, people who dedicated their lives to an ideal. It's like different journeys, different people having different understandings of how to be in the vineyard of Christ. I got mine, everybody else has got theirs, but they have remained true to their understanding of what priesthood means and what being a member of a missionary congregation is. And I just went from gravestone to gravestone to gravestone, just remembering stories, funny stories, inspirational stories about them. So all I can say is that I got an extraordinarily loving reception there. Yeah. Ingrid.
In Joseph Campbell's Hero of the Journey, the lowest point is the dark night of the soul, where you're in your own cave, alienated, and some people are annihilated, where they have real existential angst, and they really do feel abandoned by everything. What would you say to that condition?
Yeah. Firstly, I would say that on the day before I got lost on June 10th, Ingrid was giving a brilliant talk here on the hero's journey. She'd send me kind of slides of what she was going to do, and it was absolutely brilliant. So it went really well, Ingrid? Yeah, really brilliant. So she'd done in much, much more detail with some really beautiful pictographic illustrations of the hero's journey and the many phases of the hero's journey. And the question she's saying out, what happens when we hit the lowest point? It's important, I don't think there's any way of making significant psychological or sociological shifts unless we experience deep, deep, deep crisis. I see that as the individual journey. I see it in relationships. Every relationship is going to go through, I say this many times as a psychologist, relationship is going to go through 4 phases. Firstly is infatuation. You fall in love with the other person. You think the sun and the moon and the stars shine on your beloved. You can see no wrong in her. She can see no wrong in you. That's the first phase. The second phase is intimacy. We now begin to share ourselves, our bodies, our dreams, our finances, our future. It's very easy to stay connected during that phase. The third phase always comes in an interpersonal relationship, and it's called disillusionment. And it sounds like it's a pejorative, but it's a positive because it means the shattering of the illusion. Disillusionment means the shattering of the illusion, because the first 2 stages are an illusion. I'm not really in love with you. I'm in love with a fantasy, or I'm in love with whom I want you to be. And initially, you're going to try to be the person, I fantasize you to be. So you're going to present me with your persona, and then you're going to present you with the persona, 2 masks, trying to, in some senses, intoxicate each other. But at some stage, the ego is going to shine through, and oh my God, I can't believe it. And then my ego is going to come out to battle it. So the second phase is 2 egos battling. But if we stay with it, the 4th phase is real love, where the soul comes through instead of the ego, and now it's 2 souls dancing instead of 2 egos battling or 2 personas pretending. So you get that in interpersonal dynamics. And you get it as well in the journey of individual groups. Entire nations have to go through situations where there's such a crisis that the only way through is to make radical shifts in how we're doing life on planet Earth, as individuals, as communities, and as nations. There is never a significant shift in human consciousness or even in geological evolution which is not occasioned by some kind of a global crisis. So we can curse our luck and say, I can't believe I was born in these times. The Chinese had a great proverb for it. They say, may you live in interesting times. because you're here to stretch and to grow as an individual, as a community, and as a global species. And we're not going to radically, do life differently by putting little kind of band-aids on our issues. We need to break through completely, and every single person needs to be our friend and our brother and our sister. There are no good guys and bad guys in this. There are people playing different roles in order to make the entire system wake up and do it differently. So dividing the camps into good guys and bad guys is totally inimical. This is why Jesus would say, love your enemy. You're going to learn as much from your enemy as you are from your friend. In fact, your enemies will stretch you to go places your friends can't lead you, because your friends, will make life very easy for you, and you become a narcissist. Your enemies will make life difficult for you, and you're going to have to stretch and grow. So whatever situation we find ourselves in as individuals, in your own life journey, as interpersonal relationships, as communities, as a nation, our nation right now, or our world right now, there is no enemy here in the sense that somebody who doesn't have a valid viewpoint, who is not to be listened to, who is not to be engaged in a dialogue. Every one of us is bringing a little piece of the puzzle of incarnation to it, and we need to benefit from the wisdom of everybody else. And so that's what I would say with the dark night of the soul is a vitally important stage of the journey into enlightenment. You can't get that without going through that place. It's the ultimate, when we leave God, we devolve. We come from source, to individual souls, to a psychic body, to a mental body, to emotional body, to etheric body, to physical body, and we're at the low stage of devolution, and now evolution begins, growing back into the light. But you have to reach that down point in order to begin the ascent. Bonnie.
I didn't want to speak before because it was so fun and interesting and your journey. But then Ingrid managed to bring us down to the depths. So I'm going to join and deepen it, maybe. What I wanted to ask earlier, but now I want to say, is that, and you've already spoken to that. What kept coming to me was like what do we do? What do we do in this time when the world is looks like at times it's going to be blown apart, and we see and sometimes feel empathy enough, never enough, but with all the suffering. And then I thought of Leonard Cohen's just line where he says, 1 million people holding a candle for hope that never comes, for love that never comes. And I think you just spoke to all that. And I guess it's just carry on and see it all dissolve and find a new way.
Great point, Buddy. So it's very important. That's a beautiful song of Leonard Cohen's, and it's obviously from his Dark Night of the Soul place, Oh, okay. Well, it kind of crystallizes the notion of the Dark Night of the Soul. It becomes really, really important to have a sense of history. And the truth of the matter is, even a cursory perusal of world history over even the last, if you look at it, history as recorded through mythology, history as recorded through literature, and history as recorded through official historians, and you look at the amount of violence in our world right now, it is minuscule in comparison to what we have been through. For my trip to Ireland, I took an iPad with me and I downloaded documentaries on the history of India, 6 episodes, the history of China, 6 episodes, the history of the Medicis, 4 episodes. And when you look back in history, there was non-stop, genocide was like a global pastime. Again and again and again and again. I told you I've just finished writing a book. I finished it actually on the 1st of June before I left for Ireland, going through the Tanakh, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, and the constant genocide that's recorded as being God's will is ferocious. So when you actually read through world history, there has never been less violence in our world than now. The problem is we got a mass media who are intent on putting people against each other and focusing on if it bleeds, it leads. The other stuff that's happening, the great stuff that's happening, we don't hear about it. So having a sense of history is really vital. Otherwise, we're going to just be in total despair. If you take a little, let's say, give me an example, a fruit fly. The average life expectancy of a fruit fly is 2 days. So you get basically 120 generations of fruit flies in 1 year. You take a single fruit fly's experience of life, and let's say the fruit fly is born during the middle of a tornado, and it is born, lives and dies in the middle of a tornado. As far as that fruit fly is concerned, life is a tornado. 2 weeks later, another fruit fly is born, it's balmy weather. It lives for 2 days, its entire experience of life is this beautiful, balmy weather. You can't, think of history in 2-day segments, or even in 70-year segments. So having a sense of history is vital. The second thing I would say is this. It is so important to realize that the soul is eternal. And that the soul, before it comes down, we come down in cohort groups. And as I said, there are levels of the cohort, from your soulmate, to your family of origin, to your immediate community, to your tribe, to your nation, and to the species itself. In fact, to all living beings on any planet, ETs or elsewhere. We're all part of God's family. And when we come down onto planet Earth particularly, before we come, we only know 2 things. We know the track history of everybody we're coming down with. Every single person who's going to be on the planet at the same time. We know their track history, what they're capable of doing and what they cannot do. So we're not blindsided. And the second thing is, we know what our mission is. I know precisely what I'm coming down to do. And with those 2 pieces of information, we volunteer for incarnation. The problem is there's amnesia created. And we think, what the hell just happened? How did I get born into a deformed body or into a poor family? You were born into it because that's what you planned. You were born into world history at this stage to be alive on the 24th of June 2018 because you planned to be here. And you had a good idea what the situation was going to call for you and what the external environment was going to look like. And you said, send me. And what have you come to do? To wake yourself up to that realization, to help wake up the rest of us, and to create Christ consciousness on the planet. You volunteered to be here. But when we forget that we volunteered, we're subject to anxiety and fears of all kinds. We have to stop trying to impose our ego on God's trajectory. Things will change in precisely the way in which they're meant to change. So we have to realize, I've said this to you before, there are 7 timelines. There's the fictitious past, the stuff written by the victors. There's the actual past, what actually happened. Both of those influence us. There's the fictitious present, we call it fake news. And there's the real present, what's actually happening right now. And we're influenced by both of those. And there are 3 futures. There is the defined inevitable outcome, which I don't believe in. I do not believe such a future exists, that there's a defined deterministic outcome and we can't escape it. I don't believe that exists, but many people do. But there are 2 other futures. There's the probable future, which will happen if we don't change what we're doing as individuals, as a nation, as a globe, whatever. And there's the possible future. What will happen if we make the kinds of changes that are going to bring in different kinds of times? So now we're subject to those 7 influences. How are you going to deal with them? How au fait are you with the fictitious history? How au fait are you with the actual history? How au fait are you with the current, fictitious news, fake news? How au fait are you with the reality of what's actually happening right now? And how much you're prepared to engage with, the possible future rather than be kind of like a deer in the headlights looking at the probable outcome of just continuing to do what we're doing right now. And the last thing I would say to you, Bonnie, because it's a great question, is that we have to realize that there are levels of compassion. The first level of compassion is literally physiological. We're actually wired in such a way that there are neurons in the brain, they're called mirror neurons, that are activated. When you see somebody suffering, what's going on in their physical brain, you're duplicating in the same area of your own brain. They've done this test, for instance, with monkeys, really cruel test, where they put electrodes on one monkey, watching another monkey being tortured. And they have electrodes on the other monkey's head as well. And they're looking at what areas of the brain are being activated by the torture. And the guy who's witnessing it, the monkey who's witnessing it, the same areas of his brain are being activated. So the first level of compassion is literally physiological. If you attend a lecture and the speaker has a frog in his throat, you find yourself going, it's like you're trying to clear your throat on the speaker's behalf. So the first level is physiological. The second level of compassion is psychological. You feel emotional compassion for somebody who is suffering. And that's really, really beautiful. But there's a third level, and it is very important to attain that. And that comes from the realization that every single one of us is going to find our way home. And that ultimately people, have to be responsible for their own journeys. We can contribute to them. We can be minor players in their drama. But everybody is the star of their own show. And so the compassion that says eventually, no matter how many mistakes you make or I make, every one of us is going to get there. So there's a serenity comes from the third level of compassion. I'm not saying we ignore the other two, but we can be easily tripped up by them if we don't operate basically from the third level.
Just to deepen it a little bit further,
Yes.
I wanted to say that I really appreciate all of your symbolism about your journey. And you may have skipped over an important symbol. I wanted to hear your spin on it.
Sure.
The map that was written on the back of the kitten food. So
Okay. I know as an owner of cats, this is very important to you. That was hilarious to me. When I actually got home, I don't know if you looked at the back of that map, it was a box of kitty food that this 70-year-old farmer who's welding his tractor, obviously this is a real tough guy who's welding his tractor on Saturday, and at the back of it is his kitty food. Look, I didn't see the kitties because they ran obviously when they saw the stranger arriving. But that realization, that we share this planet with all life form, from kittens to banana slugs, from oak trees to mountains. Every single one of them is an articulation of the divine. Everything that exists is a word of God made flesh. The only differences among species are the level of the self-awareness on this spacesuit. So you can take a very, very, evolved soul who might incarnate for an experience as a dog or a kitten. Now, they're constrained by the limitations of the physical body in which they find themselves, but the spirit can soar. How many of you have been touched, and inspired by a pet that you've had, or inspired by an oak tree you've seen, or a mountain, that you've climbed? And so everything that exists is the Word of God made flesh. The only difference is different spacesuits have different levels of self-awareness. Given that we're human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, we're expected to be self-aware to the extent that we realize we are God enfleshed, and so is everybody else and every other species, and to operate from that realization.
So my question has to do with Ingrid's Dark Night of the Soul. What do you think causes the shift out of that?
Okay. What causes the shift from the dark night of the soul? Two things cause the shift. Firstly, there's a soul down there. It's the dark night of a soul, which is an eternal entity. It's always been, it always will be. So no matter how dark it is, there's a diamond at the core of it. The old Celtic tradition was that night and dark are not enemies of each other. The night is the dark, fecund womb that gives birth to the light. And that happens in the, from Samhain to Bealtaine. That is the darkness of winter that gives birth to the light of summer. So the darkness is the mother of the light. It's not the annihilator of the light, like we find in Western theology very often. That realization, darkness always gives birth to light. So that becomes very, very important. And the second thing I would say is, the presence of loving friends and family. They may not be able to rescue us from the experience of it, but they can just, hold faith in us that ultimately, either in this incarnation or a subsequent one, that we'll find our way home. I'll give you the last word, Patricia.
When you were speaking about that third level of compassion, what came to my mind immediately was what Jesus said when Martha and Mary were with him, and he said, "The poor you will always have with you." Is that similar to what you're speaking of?
Good. That's brilliant. It's very important. It's beautiful. That's great. I wouldn't have thought of that connection. That's brilliant, Patricia. So Patricia's question is, there's a great story. There's actually a great hymn about that as well. The poor you always have with you. I'm not going to be with you for long more. So sometimes we have to realize that there's so much stuff that needs to be attended to out there. There's so many places we put our money or put our energies, and we can spend all our time doing good, and lose our our focus, overextend. Because if we're out of alignment with the realization that ultimately everybody gets there, and in some sense of the word, everybody has chosen the large parameters of the life they're experiencing. I'm not saying the details of it, but I'm saying the overall structure, because they came into a particular kind of a body, in a particular kind of a family, in a particular culture, at a particular period of human history. So in that sense, we've chosen the outlines, the structure, the skeleton of the experience. The details will be different. So it's important to realize that, compassion must account for the fact that there's a self-choosing element to what people are experiencing, and to balance that against kind of the details of it, and the kind of the vicissitude and the terror that's experienced, and our necessity to intervene meaningfully but not take responsibility for. Responsibility is the ability to make responses, not to be the cause of. It's misunderstood very often. English responsibility does not mean it's my fault. It means I have the ability to respond. So there's very different, the ability to respond to a situation, I find, and to feel like it's my fault, or I have to solve it completely for the other person. So guys, let's continue with our Eucharist. Before we continue, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.